terrible names, he occupies that space of unbelonging. He doesn't fall into the larger societal web or the larger social world. He's an outsider, he's a misfit, he's, or it's not even a he or a she necessarily. It's an outsider, it's marginalized, it's isolated and alienated, and it has no friends, no family, and doesn't have the prospects of actually having a family of its own. And therefore, it lies really at the center of that notion of unbelonging. But it's not enough to just say that. Well, what does that mean? It means that generally the unbelonging occupy a space of invisibility. Visibility, invisibility, and voice become very important in the world of unbelonging. So when we talk about visibility, we're talking about being recognized, being acknowledged, being understood, having a place, having a purpose, having reason for being in the world. And of course, this monster doesn't have any of those resources because it's disconnected from the larger culture and it is considered an outlaw. Also, those people that occupy that kind of space of voicelessness, not being able to have any purpose or force in the world, and no visibility or no acknowledgement, by being invisible, they become ghost figures. So as ghosts, they are haunting figures, and they're haunted. They're haunted by their pasts, they're haunted by their deeds, they're haunted by all of the things they can't become, and of course they're ghost-like and ghostly in their everyday being because they don't exist. They don't exist because generally they're kept secret. And of course the creature is kept secret. And because he's kept secret, he has to be kept hidden. And he's part of that repressed. So those three things go together. And he, in this case, is part of the supernatural. So all these themes go together, obviously, as a kind of understanding of representing, I guess, that overall thematic of unbelonging. Now, in Frankenstein, it's not just the monster or the fiend that is unrecognized and part of unbelonging, but it is also Dr. Frankenstein himself. First of all, he defies the science of his day. He goes outside the boundaries of acceptable practice. He doesn't observe the laws and rules and regulations, and therefore he has to secret himself away and build a lab in Ingolstadt that nobody is really aware of, not even his family, and he becomes obsessed. And in becoming obsessed, he loses sight of himself, his society, his education, and his family. And he becomes a kind of ghostly figure himself. And then, with all of the secrets and lies and deceptions and hiddenness away, he becomes a ghost figure himself. And everything he strived for and all of his ambition and all of the noble deeds that he had intended for himself, he becomes kind of invisible. And ironically, he becomes invisible, yet he creates, or at least attempts to create life. And in attempting to create life, he manages only to alienate not only the creature he creates, but his family, and at the expense of all that is important and relevant to him, he loses everything in the end. So he really represents that world of unbelonging as well. Then you have Walton, who's the major player in terms of understanding the larger monster at work here, which is the monster of imperialism or colonization. And Walton really wants to discover the Northwest Passage. And he is equally as ambitious and mirrors, in a doubling kind of way, Frankenstein. So Frankenstein meets him at the beginning of the story as a kind of gesture or nod to say, listen, you suffer from the same madness as me, and I can attest to the fact that you don't want to go here, because what's going to become of you is far more tragic than what you would achieve in terms of fame and glory that you perceive, self-perceive. So Walton ostensibly sacrifices, or is willing to sacrifice, his crew and his sailing family to move through the Northwest Passage, which in discovering the Northwest Passage, if we go to Google Earth and look at it, it's pretty phenomenal. If you get an opportunity to look at it, you should go into the Northwest Passage. It's a tiny place. And then the British discovered Hudson's Bay as a result of it. I mean, it's insane how they got there from England, just traveling down. It's really quite something. So Walton, his visibility, his acknowledgement, I've saved all my life, I've done everything I can to achieve this. I'm doing it, we're going forward, we're not turning around, you know. All of that, in the end, his visibility, his acknowledgement, his fame, none of that will come to fruition because his lack of humanity, herein lies the moral, or the morality undergirding the story. All of this blind ambition ends up being about overreaching. And overreaching really ends up creating a history or a past where it's very hard to look at yourself and to be proud in any real way of your achievements or your accomplishments, because what you've done to arrive there is discredit and dehumanize and debase others. And therefore you really didn't achieve your goal, and you became nothing but a mere ghost that's haunted by all of your secrets and all of your deeds. And you're going to find that these themes recur and recur and recur in all of our stories, which bring us under the larger umbrella of this idea of unbelonging. Now, when we look at the story of Frankenstein, we have to think about, well, how is it narrated? What's the narrative point of view? And the narrative point of view is usually, on some level, understood by different strategies that authors take, by dominating voices, particular voices having control of our points of view or how we see things, whether it's subjective or objective, and playing with us as a kind of strategy, working through this notion of the author, work, reader triad, that triadic relationship. So always keeping the reader in mind. Well, how can we persuade the reader to believe or to have sympathy for a villainous character or a hideous monster? You know, and this is the irony again, because the monster, when he meets the DeLacy family and the old blind man, ironically, is not judged. He's loved as a human being. He's loved as a person with a thoughtful spirit and a good spirit, because he's considered the good spirit of the forest, and he does kind deeds and kind things for all of his people that he's taking care of the family. So when the family abandons him, and when the family rejects him because they can see his appearance and they're afraid of his monstrousness, which ironically is the antithesis or the opposite of what kind of person he really is. He may be hideous to behold, and he may be monstrous and ugly and hard to look at, but his soul, his spirit is good, and he's kind. His kindness is threatened and warped as a result of humanity's mistreatment of him. Now, we all want to be, say, well, none of us asked to be born, and we didn't. So that, again, links back to the fact that, well, he's like all of us. He didn't ask to be born, but we're born anyways. The difference is that when we're born, hopefully, most of us have a mother who nurtures us, who cares for us, who loves us, who raises us, and a father who loves us and raises us and cares for us, and siblings. And we learn to read and write, and we learn to walk, and we learn to crawl, and we, all those things are kind of backwards, but we learn, and we learn from other people in the community. This particular child, infant, because that's what he is even though he's born a grown man of composite parts, is thrown into the world, into a society that's under threat of disease, That dis-ease is atmospheric of the unsettledness of what's going on at the time in Ingolstadt, and everyone blames and persecutes the monster, thinking he's responsible for this plague that has, is happening, because everyone's living in a state of fear. And it's interesting how post-colonial readings of the monster are not about the fiend, the wretch, the creature, but they're really about this imperialism, this colonization, and how colonization and the ways in which we address the species of man and the ways in which we treated other human beings from other places and othered them based on visual significations of their skin difference or skin color or religious belief systems or environments or food or whatever it was, ended up meaning, well, whoever is going to dominate in conquest is going to be the civilized nation. And that civilized nation is going to civilize all others. So really, when you read this from a post-colonial narrative perspective, you can see that Mary Shelley's talking about the rapid industrialization, the movement away from nature, the movement into the urban centers of cities, the fact that cities were growing exponentially, and how removed we are becoming, and how fragmented from our own humanity, and our fears of what we don't understand, or what we don't, what we don't know, ironically, in Africa, for example, post-colonial writers have written on African spaces, for example, and talked about the engineering marvels of early African architecture, well before Mary Shelley, in terms of how the sun would move around cities that were built into the ground in the earth, and how housing and, different kinds of techniques were used to keep everybody warm, to keep everything growing, to know where the sun would be and how it would be in April as opposed to how it would be in January. And having all that knowledge and all that ability to engineer and make sense of irrigation and plant life and growth and agriculture was so sophisticated, beyond anything the Brits had ever understood. They couldn't even deal with basic scurvy. They couldn't figure that it was, pine needles. It wasn't birch. It was actually pine needles that were reduced and boiled that enabled the indigenous population to avoid scurvy. And they gave that to the British to help them to understand why their ships were coming back as ghost ships. So you really have to kind of think about what's at work in these stories of unbelonging, and how the characters, their blind ambitions, kind of mirror the cultural crises that are going on at this time. This is very important. This is the complexity of the answers I'm looking for to meet the University 1 standard required to get through the course. So how does this relate, well, to something like Real Engine, for example? Well, when we're talking about an indigenous population, and remember, it's how the story is told. I mean, remember, point of view. This is an epistolary novel. In other words, it's told through letters. It's like texting or email or something, but it's an earlier version. It's letter writing. It's a lost art now, letter writing, but that's how the story is told. So it'd be like we're texting a story back and forth. It's a dialogue about what's happening and what's going on. And Victor's not answering the letters. When you don't get a text to answer, do you know how frustrated you get? So think about how tensions are being built in the narrative. And we open with this wicked scene of entropy on the Arctic terrain, of the creature following his creator and the creator chasing the creature in this entropeic kind of maelstrom on a barren, isolated landscape. Quite the atmosphere. And then you have all this tension, because then goes from Walton and Walton's story, and it shifts back to the past. And the past, of course, is the ghost and the haunting, being haunted by the past, being haunted by the colonial conquest and colonization, and fear of otherness, and fear of what you don't understand, and being afraid of knowledge and power behind knowledge, and not being open and honest, being deceptive. These things will create all kinds of problems for you, and Frankenstein is the epitome of that representation of that monster. So Real Engine is different because it's a different genre, so it's contrastingly quite different. But what's interesting about Real Engine is it's told by a native man who tells the story self-reflexively. He says, I'm going to tell you this story, and I'm going to put myself in the story, and the story is going to be about the ways in which the colonizers viewed us and wrote us. And not wrote us literally, but visually. Literally and visually. Wrote us in pictures, in moving pictures. And starting from the silent cinema era, here is the story that was told about Indians. And the story that was told about Indians was one singular universal story of that, that tribal Indian on the Plains Indian. Well, Neil Diamond is saying that's not our story. And that's the story of colonization, and that's the story that wants to be represented so that it can assuage the guilt and the sins of the fathers for doing what they did to the indigenous population and for the cultural genocide that occurred. And again, cultural genocide, a big ghost, right? A big haunting, a big cultural crisis. So Neil Diamond uses all kinds of things in this documentary. He uses interesting montage, so that's like filmic ability to put certain pictures together to create a story. He uses that self-reflexivity. He uses many cartoons and different kinds of mediums in his work. He uses mythologies, like the mythology of Crazy Horse. He uses real events like the Trail of Tears, Wounded Knee, the Academy Awards, and the kind of resistance movements that were going on. He talks about the American Indian movement, AIM. He talks about activists like John Trudell, and he talks about embodying the human spirit through the use of humor. He uses a lot of humor, a lot of satire, and a lot of mockery. And he uses those things as strategies to get us to own our shit, so to speak. In other words, to take accountability for what role we play in the perpetuation of these stereotypes, these prejudices, and these discriminations. And the way that he does that is through making fun of himself and fun of First Nations. And it's a really clever strategy, and it's very successful, because what he ends up doing, which is what his project really is he ends up saying, here's Antoujouart, I can never say the word, the Fast Runner. The Fast Runner is the final Inuit cinema in the birth, or in the Renaissance, which is the period when natives start writing themselves. They start speaking their languages, they start self-identifying, and they're no longer going to represent themselves through the lens of the colonizing and dominant subjectivity, that they've been under or undergone since the birth of the cinema. And he says, and this is when we are ourselves. This is when we are who we want to be and how we see ourselves, not how anybody else saw us or sees us. And that is a true Indigenous cinema. So The Real Engine is a play, obviously, as well, satirizing, of course, that notion of that tribal native or Plains Indian, and real punning on the actual notion of cinematic apparati, or the ideology behind cinema's apparatus. Because, I mean, even the apparatus has an ideological purpose if it wants to. So, of course, what does this come down to with this notion of visibility and haunting and unbelonging? Well, obviously, if you're not writing yourself, and you're not part of your own history, and you're not writing your history, then somebody else is giving a universalist narrative about you. And that is placing you in a marginal position of exile. And that makes you ghostly, invisible, and it also shows a past that's being suppressed. And because it's being suppressed, you're not getting it written, and therefore you're being haunted by untruths and deceptions and deceits and lies. Lies that fade into the black chalkboard, as we'll come to see when we look at red anger. Okay? That metaphoric or symbolic collection of lies by the dominant, and you can call them colonizers instead of white versus black, because those are constructs and they don't actually exist. So when we get to Real Engine, we have that kind of narrative point of view that's told through first person, but he uses a lot of other mediums and medias to talk and to speak out. And he does get there, which is great. In Red Anger by R.T. Smith, you have a whole different world happening. You have the world of the speaker who's retrospectively looking at I asked you to sort of take